For those of you that don't know what you're looking at, I pity you, because this is a very important render. In fact, this is the official render of day 2 of Nodevember. Nodevember is the official month of the year where we have 30 prompts. Some people are saying it's 15, 2 prompts per day. I'm not doing that. This is intentional. And as you've already seen on the render, what I'm going to make today for a garden is a Japanese lily pad garden. Yes, Japan has lily pad gardens. I looked it up. Okay, delete everything and make a new object, geometry nodes, and make that a geonodes object. Add in a grid. This is going to be our water surface, and because it's our water surface, it's going to need to have significantly more geometry. You can think of each of these points as basically a point of displacement that we get to control. And speaking of displacement, I want to have like a ripple source, so like we can have one here and one here, and what these ripple sources are doing is they're emanating kind of like these rings of water, as if like a water droplet fell. They're emanating these rings of water that displace the surface, but then also kind of weaken over time, right? The outermost ring is going to be like the most least energetic. Okay, so here's how we're going to do that. I'm going to use a distribute points on faces node to make our like source points for this, and I want there to be way less. So I'm going to use Poisson disk and increase the minimum distance so that we have fewer of them, but none of them are overlapping. And because we have multiple points here, whatever calculation we need to do, because these waves need to add together, we need to do this calculation multiple times. We're going to import in a repeat zone. If you don't have this, that means you have to update your version of Blender, maybe to 4.1. And to displace our water, I'm going to use a set position node where we want to modify the Z component. Again, that is like the normal to the water, and that should be dependent on these points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a geometry proximity and calculate the distance from the points. And it's this distance that we're going to use to calculate the Z value, or basically the height. So this is going to be the offset, which you can see makes this kind of like crazy looking map because it's looking at the closest point of many points and stuff like this. So instead of geometry proximity, I just kind of baited you there. What I want to do is I want to find this distance map for a single point. So I'm going to sample the index of our points, and for the index, I'm going to have a different one for each iteration. So I'm going to take this input and add 1, and then map this to the output. So basically this value is going to start off at 0. It's going to add 1, go back to the beginning, then 2, 3, 4. And this is what I want the index to be. So for each repetition, we are sampling our points at this index, and what we want is we want the position of this. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm basically going to calculate the distance manually. We want the distance between our position, here's distance, between our position and the position of the index we're looking at. Meaning we can now take this and plug it in directly. Actually, make sure this is plugged in where I said it was. You should have warned me. This distance can now be our Z component, and you can see it's distorting this, but only from like a single like source point. So I want to take this and transform it into ripples. I can do this by taking a math node, and I'm going to set this to sine, and we're going to multiply the period by a bigger number so that we actually get these waves. This should also be not as strong of a wave, so I'm going to divide it by a big number. At the beginning, these rings should be the strongest, right? The waves should be bigger, and then as they emanate outwards, these ripples become smaller and smaller and smaller, and that is going to be proportional to the distance. Well, you can think of the energy that emanates out of our source position as being like stored in this circumference, and the circumference is just equal to pi times the distance. In other words, it kind of grows linearly, which means that the energy dissipates linearly. So we can add another division, and we can divide by the distance, which is going to make this like stronger than we want. So I'm just going to again decrease this. Let me actually increase the number of ripples so you can see. I can add a bit of an offset. So this is what this addition does. It offsets it, and I want to offset it by a time parameter. So now it's going to animate with time, but it's too fast and it's backwards. So I'm going to divide by, let's say, -10, except the peak of this is ridiculous. And that's because we're dividing by the distance, which you can sometimes imagine we'll divide by 0. So I'm just going to do a tiny modification to our distance, and that's going to be adding a very tiny quantity, just so at the worst we're not dividing by 0, but we're dividing by like, let's say 0.1. Well, remember, we distributed a bunch of points, and we get to repeat everything we did for as many iterations as we want. Meaning, if I take this iteration and bump it up to 2, now we have 2 ripples, and they should be additive. And I can increase the number of water sources. Of course, I don't want it to be too many or too strong. Tiny tiny quality of life thing. I'm gonna set shade smooth and take everything inside of here, Control G to make it a group. This is gonna be our ripple node group. Give it a nice blue color. How about that? And the next thing is we need our lily pad. Then we can scatter it and distort it and all of this. So for now, I want you to forget all of this, and we're gonna work on the lily pad, which you can think of as basically like a Pac-Man shape. It's a circle, but with like a wedge cut out of it. And the fastest way to make this is actually not a circle, but using the arc primitive, which again is procedural. I'm allowing it. And the arc primitive is basically like taking a section of the circle, but we don't have our wedge. Just click connect center, and now you have your wedge. It's literally that easy. And now I also want to move the center point by using a set position. So I'm moving points. We want the one directly in the center, so it should be easy to isolate. So I'm going to take the position and check where it is equal to 0, 0, 0. And we can have this be a bit forgiving with the epsilon so that we can connect the selection. And now we can modify just that point. I'm going to move it here and move it down a little. And the first thing you might be thinking is that we should like fill in this curve so it actually has geometry or a face, and that's kind of right, but it's going to present an issue. So the way we do that is we'd use fill curve, which does that, except if we look at the geometry, it's kind of like ugly. Like every point is making a triangle with the center, which means if I now kind of distort this edge on the z-axis, it's going to look a bit weird. So instead, I'm going to do something infinitely more complicated. We're going to connect this with a grid, and I'm going to make the grid bigger, and I'm going to give this a bunch of geometry. Basically, I'm going to take this grid and say only keep the part of this grid that is inside our outline. Finally, we have an opportunity to use our geometry proximity. We want to know the proximity to an edge, and that is what we're going to basically use as a delete geometry mask, such that the distance, when it is less than some amount, it is deleted. So let's see what that looks like. Slap that on. Okay, now as we increase this, you can see it's kind of making our nice separation between the inside and the outside. So let me show you what I'm calling a new CG matter trick. We need to delete geometry again, but for this outside island, and remember what I just said there, I said island, meaning I can take the mesh island that has island indices. We don't use this very often, but I check where this is equal to some integer, and that is where I'm going to delete. One thing you might notice though is that the edge is now kind of like jagged. To kind of smooth this out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the position. So let's connect in our position here. I'm going to modify it with a blur attribute set to vector, connect that right there, and you can see the more iterations we have, the smoother this becomes. I don't want this to have an even surface, or do I want the outline to kind of look like a circle? Starting with the outline of this, what we can do is we can kind of go back to the beginning, to this section right here, and this is where I want to do some distortion. So I'm going to add another set position. Our like change is going to be based on noise, which you can see kind of on average moves this to the top right. The way you correct for that is you subtract every axis by 0.5. I'm going to take this and I'm going to not scale, but actually multiply. I want to make sure that this outline is kind of flat on the z-axis. I'm going to set this to 0. And then I can take the scale of x and y and kind of change it here. So now we have nice control over the shape of this lily pad. Another thing I want to add is I want to add like up and down noise. I'm just going to copy this section over, connect it to offset, but this time it's the opposite. We only want it to be on the z-axis. There we go. I just want to add some like variation to our lily pad so it's not as intense, and let's bring the scale down. I can take everything here, Control G to make it a node group, kind of like the repeat zone, right? So I can call this lily pad. So I'm gonna make it green. First thing I want to do is I want to put our lily pads on the water. We can deal with the issues, the repercussions in just a bit. I don't actually need to use this repeat zone section. I can actually just go back to the source, this grid, and I can distribute points on faces again. So here are some points. I want to have many more of them. These are the points where I want to instance our lily pads on. Lily pad is the instance, which obviously is too big. It's too big, so let's bring down the scale using some randomness so they're not all the same size. So they should go down to like something like that. And by the way, you're going to see that they're like on the water surface, or actually right in the middle, so they're not on top of the water. And this is kind of the issue we're going to run into. Just so it's visually out of the way, I can use a translate instances and bring this up. But now we have the issue where some of them are being spawned on the perimeter, which is a bummer. To fix that, we just use a different grid, right? So one with a smaller x and y, connect that here. And actually, we don't need this much geometry if this part isn't going to be distorted. Notice that this actually changes the distribution, so feel free to play with the seed a little. So now the question is, how do we map these on? That's a good question. Well, what I'm thinking is we can take these lily pads and literally like project them on the water. So it's kind of like shrink wrapping it to the surface. And this is going to make it kind of like conform to the shape of the water. What we're going to need is a ray cast. So we are casting rays to our water surface in the negative Z direction. It's very important to realize our instances. So we actually have geometry to work with. Set position on these lily pads and map them to the hit position. And now you can see they're on the surface of the water. Although there are issues with this, we lose our noise from before where everything doesn't have the same height and it's exactly on the water. The second part's very easy to fix. You just add some Z offset. So we lost our noise variation, and I'm thinking it probably makes more sense to apply it after this operation anyways. In our lily pad, instead of applying this like noise thing, what we can do is instead we can just store it for later. This is going to be our attribute for later. It's going to be a vector, and this is going to be its value. And we should just be able to plug in our named attribute. This one again is called noise, and it's there. It's too strong, but it is definitely there. I'm going to scale this effect by like a tinier number, which kind of keeps our distortion from before, but also makes it above the water surface. So this is basically going to be a bit of a balancing act between the offset and the amount of noise. We could make like a custom function for this, but I'm feeling especially lazy today, so this is going to be fine for us. So with these lily pads, what I can do is I can run a extrude mesh, which for some reason, it really didn't like that operation. I think it's because we have individual enabled. So disable this, and now we can actually set the extrusion to just be a tiny bit. We can go back to that later if there's issues. So with our lily pads, I'm going to set shade smooth and do that at the very end here after the extrusion. And if you're seeing this facetting, I think this is because it's mapping onto the water surface, which itself isn't very geometric. Yep, that is the issue. Back in the water, back to square one. Let's quadruple, or I guess times 8 in the X and Y sense, although that's running pretty slow. Let's add more variation. So I'm going to use a random value for the random rotation, which does some like weird stuff. It's because X and Y should be equal to 0. So now they can only rotate on the Z axis, which will still let it map and do all its kind of stuff. I'm going to have this go from pi to negative pi. And the reason I'm kind of mapping it to the minimum possible interval is because I'm already thinking, I was already there. I want to have these rotate over time as well. So I can scale this. And you can see as I increase the scale, they rotate, some of them faster than others. So I'm literally going to connect our time node, which is going to be way too fast. Going to divide by, let's say 10. Okay, still too fast. 100. There we go. And I guess it would be proportional to their size, meaning I don't actually want to change the seed here. The fact that they're the same seed is actually good news. I didn't even think about that last time. That's good. But they can also move on the surface of the water. And when they move, they should still be respecting the ripples. So I'm going to translate instances again. And instead of putting in a translation value like custom or by hand, I'm going to use a noise texture yet again. But just to be safe, I'm going to multiply the Z axis by 0. And of course, this should be animating over time. So I'm going to make it one dimensional because we don't really care about X or Y noise, just like a general number. So that's okay. But now they're all moving exactly the same, which we would expect because they all get the same W value. I'm just going to add one more little piece de resistance. Do you notice I say piece de resistance at least once in a tutorial? I'm going to add a index, which is different for every instance, and just to vary this a bit more, kind of offset this by 25. Now these should all be moving in a separate direction. That's great. Okay, I played around with some settings, basically changing the seed until I got a look that I liked, and none of these seem to be going to the edge, at least not yet. But there's a couple issues. First of all, on the first frame, they're all pointing the same direction. It's kind of creepy, really. And this is because our rotation is based on a scaling, ultimately by the frame number, which starts at frame 1. Simple fix, you're just going to add a very big number, like 150, and now they don't all start pointing the same way. And now a second issue I'm seeing is they all look like really identical, right? I'm just going to make a second version and make sure to click this button. I'm just going to call this pad 2 so that these are separate. Go to the settings of the first one. So this could have like a wider or like a narrower thing. And then I can move this more towards the outside surface. I don't know if that's how it would work technically, but that's what I'm saying. Instead, I'm going to use a second instance on point, so we're literally going to do them separately. Connect scale to scale, rotation to rotation, and then points to points. It's all going to be identical, but the only difference here, and let me actually just join these together. To make these a bit different, I want to separate the points in half into like two separate kind of bins. We separate geometry by a random value. That's going to be a Boolean. Do I have water? I need it. And now I can use one of these points in one place and one of these points in another place. Should look a bit different. I can just play around with the seed a little. Okay, so we have that. Another thing I'm noticing, you might have noticed it too. There's no material or anything, right? We've done the geometry nodes. Now we got to do the shading and rendering. So we're going to do this in cycles. So what I'm thinking is in the shading workspace, we're going to make a whole bunch of materials. One of them is going to be called water. One of them is going to be called lily. And I guess that's it. We're just going to make 2 materials. I kind of hyped that up. This one, which is coming out of the repeat zone. I know it's messy, but that's just what it is. This one's going to get water. And then the lily pads are going to get lily. With our water material, which should now only control half of this, let's make sure of that by changing the color. I want this to be peak brightness, lowest roughness, highest metallic. I don't think IOR matters, but that should be 1.33. You don't see it because there's nothing to reflect. In the world shader, I'm going to have to do this procedurally as well. I'm just going to use the sky texture node. I can bring up the amplitude so we don't get all this like blackness. We just get mainly blue. So this is definitely a good start to the water, and you can see that there's the ripples, but this looks very boring. And this is what I had for my render for a very long time until I remembered noise, very important. We're going to make our own noise map, and that noise map is actually going to be dependent on a wave texture, which makes sense because these are waves, right? And it will map correctly. So I'm going to bring up the scale so we get a lot of waves. We're going to add some distortion. We're going to bring down the detail because water shouldn't have like jagged edges. And then for the detail scale, this is what we're going to bring up. Connect that to the height. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. Wow. Now it's really catching the light, which I guess it should. Too strong. So I'm going to bring the strength down to like 0.3. And now you can see the water surface looks much better in my opinion. So for the wave texture, all we need to do is I'm going to take my object coordinates and then I'm going to move them. This is what vector math is for, on the X or the Y, whatever it is, it's got to be slow. So let's say it's the X. I'm going to take the frame number. That's what that driver was for. I'm going to divide by like 100. Let's see what that looks like. Way too fast. Divide by 1,000. Still way too fast. Divide by 5,000? Just right. Okay, lily pad material. Let's give this whole thing color so it doesn't look so weird. With the lily material, these should be green. And you can see they're trying their best, but there's just so much light. So AGX is fine. That's just what I'm using. I'm going to set this to punchy. And then also, let's bring down the exposure. There you go. That's what's making us not see the colors. For the lily pad, I don't want all of them to be the exact same color. So let's try it with geometry. It kind of depends on whether or not you realize the instances, which I guess we did. Random per island is going to look at each island and give it a random number. And this is useful because we can now vary the hue, connect that to the base color, and now these can all be individual. And there we go. We're done with the tutorial. Thanks for watching. I don't know why we made this, those colors. We are going to not vector math divide, but just math divide by, let's say, 5. We actually did this on the last tutorial. We're just doing it for a different purpose. We're going to map this until it looks, kind of like greenish orange. And because these are lily pads on the water, I imagine they're wet. So I'm going to bring down the roughness just so they're a bit shiny. Let's just add a bit of a normal map because I find that that's kind of like free detail. And one thing I want you to notice, other than that this looks trash, is that as we play this is going to change our noise. We don't want that. That should be consistent. What we're going to need is to mess with our coordinates. So first of all, object coordinates, that already seems more stable, but you can tell it's almost like this noise exists and the lily pads are coasting through it. It's not attached. And that is the case because object coordinates are being applied globally and they're not specific to any lily pad. And that's because we realized our instances and we can't not do that. So we're kind of in a pickle. So in our geometry nodes, all we need to do is just mess with the lily pad. With our lily pad at the very end, like we stored the noise, let's also store chords. That's going to be our attribute for coordinates. That's going to be position. I'm going to copy this. The reason I'm doing that is we have 2 of these. And now if we go to our shading, we should be able to use a custom attribute. So now you can see that this spins and moves with its own coordinate system. Okay, so I'm going to attach this here. This is going to be useful for a few things, but let's just look at this here. You can see that this is working. Technically, we should kind of like make the z-axis 0. But of course, this noise is strong, very strong. So first of all, I'm going to bring down the scale, just kind of play around with this. And I'm thinking the main thing is we just got to bring down the strength a little. One of the things about lily pads you'll notice in the images is that the border of this usually has like a different color, almost like a rim. We can't do that directly with shader nodes because we don't know anything about where the border is. But of course, we can bring that information over. One more attribute. We're going to call this one rim. It's going to be a float, and that rim is literally going to be the distance to the curve from before. And now we should be able to bring in the rim attribute. There you go. And you can see it kind of creates a map of like how interior this is to the surface. Bring that much closer so that we're really like isolating the rim here. We are going to mix our base color using this as a factor. I'm going to make that a very dark kind of green, which by itself actually adds quite a bit of realism. Surprising amount of realism, actually. Another thing we can do is we can darken some of this. So I'm going to, again, mix. This time I'm going to multiply by black. And just like before, I'm going to use our custom coordinate system on a custom noise texture. And this is going to be our factor. So let's see what that looks like. So this is before and after, just adding some nice variation. Let's try bringing in at least one more detail to this lily pad. You'll notice that lily pads kind of have these stripes because you can think of them as kind of like big leaves. In fact, they might be leaves. I'm not sure. You can actually use our custom coordinates to do this. I'm going to use a gradient texture, and let's connect that here. Make sure that this is set to radial. We can make this have more stripes in some sense. That's what we're going for by multiplying and then adding in a fraction. So you can see the bigger this is, the more stripes we have. And then to isolate this, I'm going to use a greater than function. And to make them not look so uniform and like weird, I'm just going to distort this a little. So again, a noise texture. My voice is going. We need to finish quickly. So linear light, we're going to use this coordinate system on the noise texture. We're going to connect this here. The reason I'm doing that is this is a setup to distort coordinates. That's what linear light is for. So as we increase this factor, you can see we're getting some distortion. Mix this color with, let's say, the color like, I don't know, pure blue, so we can see it for now. Connect this factor we just made over here. Okay, so now you can see we have these lines, and they should be, from the images I see, they should kind of be like a dark yellowish. Okay, so I think that actually adds quite a bit of realism. Okay, I added a camera. Let's increase the passer partout so we can only see a section of this. That's fine. And let's add in stuff like depth of field until only like one sliver of it is in focus. There you go. Back to rendered view, increase the f-stop until it looks, you know, like what you want. Okay, let's add some volumetrics and call it a day. So I'm going to make a cube. The cube is allowed because it's a primitive, whatever. Principled volume adds just a stupid amount of haze to the scene. We can bring down the density, and I don't want the haze to be the same everywhere. So once again, noise texture. And with this addition slider, which I think we've used this trick before, we can kind of choose like how thick, or not how thick, kind of like the contrast line of this fog thing. Whatever. Take the fog, make it the white color. That's a tutorial. I'm happy with that. Okay, we are done. I'm not doing anymore. If you want to get this blend file, link in the description. I'm making every single one available on Patreon. That's 30 files. You should get that. Subscribe to this channel. Subscribe to Deep Vault Cube. I'm going to alternate which one I upload Nodevember to, so you subscribe to both. And I'll see you tomorrow for Arcade, which I have a really good idea for.